welcome back to the show. Man, you know who it is. It's your boy, Jay Henehan. And I'm back with another episode of How to Kill a Sacred Cow. Jay Henehan back from the dead, motherfuckers. I have to apologize to two groups of people. One is the listeners of the show. It's been a long time since I've released an episode. That's because I moved out to the country from the city and started a homestead, and it is going very well, but we had to create a 9-bed garden from scratch, and we also have 7 chickens, 6 of which are hens. We raise them from chicks, so they aren't laying eggs yet, but raising them from chicks was a shit ton of work. The second apology I have to make is to tonight's guest, Matt Ehret, and I'll get to his biography in a second. I have to apologize to him because I recorded this episode almost 2 months ago. Actually, more than 2 months ago. And I want to, it's a testament to his Canadian patience because he has only contacted me once since we've done the interview and asked me quite politely, and like I said, I thank you, Matthew, and asked, what's up with the show? You're going to put it out? And I explained to him I had a ton of trouble with my computer, all of which I have obviously gotten figured out. And also we've been having terrible weather here in this area of Massachusetts, and it's been incredibly difficult because it's just been tons of rain, but thunderstorms, lots of wind, a lot of stuff got destroyed. I had to rebuild a bunch of stuff, and I of course I work 12, 13 hours a day, from when I leave the house to when I come back. So, with all of those apologies out of the way, hopefully we'll be able to continue and do the show on a regular basis. Now, the guest for tonight, like I said, is author Matt Ehret. He is the author of The Clash of the Two Americas. It's a 4-volume set, and it's so crazy. I loved this book. He sent me all of the Kindle versions, but he also sent me an audiobook version of the first volume, and it's just fucking fire, dude. It's all about, the British and how they never gave up on getting America back into the fold, and how, of course, he's Canadian. He started his writing career going through the Canadian links between the British system and how it integrated with the American system and how it should have been the 14th colony of the United States. All that will be covered in the show, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows where they can find this wonderful, wonderful man. Of course, you can go to the CanadianPatriot.org. This is kind of his home base for all of his work. And also, I would strongly suggest that you subscribe to his Substack, because along with subscribing with the Substack, you get, I think, 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, I'll go into my email and show everybody. You get 2 or 3. Oh, no, that's right. I don't have that email account on hand. He does 2 or 3 episodes a week that are just for his subscribers, and it's been fantastic. Some of them are on Thomas. They're like Thomas Paine series. I think he's got one on Kepler. He's got one on the only thing I could glean from it is like cymatics and how it affects the human body. All incredible stuff. This dude is, I can't talk this guy up enough. So everything will be here on howtokillasacredcow.com. As always, I will include all of this after we release the episode. I'll update the page. I will also include a couple of the appearances that I made recently up here in the latest episodes, and I'll make sure that everybody gets to see some of the stuff that I did in the meantime, because it's a hell of a lot easier when you don't have to edit it. But this was a wide-ranging conversation, and like I said, I can't talk this guy up enough. So, without any further ado, Matthew. So one of the things I really appreciated about your book is so at this point in my life, there's not much that surprises me or as far as information goes that I've never heard of. And your take on the creation of the Bank of America, the first Bank of America and the second Bank of America, the creators of them, and for example, like your take on Andrew Jackson. Are you familiar with the documentary called The Money Masters with Ben Stills? or Bill Stills.
Yeah, that thing rocked my world back in 2004 when I was starting to really just get shaken out of my normism. That three-part documentary really rocked my world. So that was a big part of my beginning of my pursuit of what the hell is reality actually.
For sure. Yeah, it did the same thing to me too. And where I was going with the question was that your take on the First and Second Bank of America and the people that created and or killed it is almost inverted from his interpretation of what he was looking at. And that's where I was really surprised at your work, because it's almost ubiquitous in its interpretation, in people's interpretation of those events in our type of community and authors and podcasters and stuff, that the First and Second Bank of America were attempts at creating a central bank, a central private. Exactly. Yep. And so that's why I appreciated your book, because it really brought some new evidence to light and it made me look at it differently. So how were you, how did you either reconcile contradictions when you were going through and learning about this, and how did you come to almost the opposite view of this, the First and Second Bank of America when you were writing the book?
That's a great way to frame the question, because by virtue of having early on in my journey worked through the Money Masters, which again, it's for people who haven't watched it and want like a thumbnail sketch of recent history for the past, let's say 300 years. So I say the word recent with a bit of a quotation thing. Really useful, a lot of quotes too, like direct quotes from players who were on the stage of history. And that's one of the really powerful things. It's just so full of well done quotes. However, as you pointed out, it has a certain narrative, which I have come to take a very different tone to, regarding the idea of the origins, purpose, role, and destruction of the original two national banks. I held the pro-Jackson anti-Hamilton view in my mind pretty firmly for about 3 years, and I think it was when I'd first begun researching the literature from Executive Intelligence Review and the LaRouche organization back in 2007, which had a small branch operational within Montreal at the time. This is where I was working, doing a part-time gig I despised, having a smoke break. And for people listening who might have encountered, have you encountered some of the LaRouche literature at all, or Lyndon LaRouche, EIR?
So the name is familiar. I think Webster Tarpley references LaRouche a lot, and I don't know if I've ever actually encountered his work directly.
Okay. Well, Tarpley did work with that organization for about 18 years or something. He did some of his best work when he was a part of that organization in the 70s and 80s on Venice, Venetian banking operations, how Venice took control of Britain. Really useful stuff. Anyway. But anyway, there was obviously, that was the first time I encountered an opposing view of Hamilton that took into consideration the existence of this oligarchy, because a lot of the voices that tended to support Hamilton were mainstream voices that tended to ignore the existence of a death cult oligarchy that has been trying to latch itself on like a parasite to humanity to get us to accept our enslavement. So people would tend to like Hamilton and ignore that reality. And those people who acknowledge that reality of the oligarchical parasite tended to typically despise Hamilton. So this is the first time with the LaRouche literature that I was like, okay, here are people who acknowledge the oligarchy's agenda for depopulation, global enslavement, world government, while at the same time saying that Hamilton was good. So I wanted to prove that wrong. It kind of bugged me a lot, and I found that the more I read and the more evidence that was presented to me from researchers in that organization, I couldn't account for it if I held on to my view. For example, one was, why did Hamilton fight so hard to ensure that his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, would become president? That was a big one for me. I was like, that's a tough question. I kind of acknowledge that they're nemesis, but why? And then what is it about what? And somebody also threw out the question, what is it about Aaron Burr that angered, that caused so much fear in Hamilton? What was it about Burr? Why did Burr start the Bank of Manhattan? Even J.P. Morgan has a plaque in their headquarters in honor of the murder of Hamilton and the role of Burr in creating the bank or taking over the Bank of Manhattan that gave birth to Wall Street. That itself gave birth later on to the entire banking apparatus around which J.P. Morgan is currently one of the epicenters. So why do these modern Wall Street freaks adore Aaron Burr and despise, or at least why do they adore Burr and cherish the idea that Hamilton was assassinated? Also, why did Burr end up escaping arrest after being caught working to cut up the Union into a Western Confederacy that would be pro-British, and he was caught, right? There was actually a whistleblower that blew the whistle in Congress in 1807, told Jefferson, hey, there's a plot to kill you being run by Burr, who's working with the British, who's working with American mercenaries to declare war in Spain, take control of Louisiana and New Orleans, install himself as dictator in America under the Constitution, and declare the North a separate state from the South, as both would become pro-British. And it's like, he avoided it. There was an inquiry in Congress. He was despised by the masses of the people. He had to leave in disguise from America to go to Canada to get letters where his nephew was the Governor General of Canada, who gave him letters that got him introductory meetings to meet with Lord Jeremy Bentham. He actually lived with Jeremy Bentham, the head of British intelligence, at his manor for 5 years. I couldn't account for that. And there's diary entries by Burr describing how these opium-filled, prostitution-ridden 5 years were the best years of his life, living at Jeremy Bentham's house before he was deployed back weeks before the War of 1812. So it's like all of these things, there were so many of these sorts of paradoxes that built themselves up. Another paradox that built itself up was, well, how did America survive its first few vulnerable years of existence when it was bankrupt? Every single state was bankrupt after the War of Independence. And you could see the stats, the figures. The US dollar had devalued by a factor of 90. No international body wanted to lend to the United States, so it was still an agrarian society, no industries, no manufacturing. The British never permitted America to have manufacturing for decades and decades of colonial controls. They never permitted. Every time America tried to have a protective policy to grow, let's say a leather making industry or horseshoes or hats or clothing, it would be destroyed by the British, who forbade the US to have manufacturing, which is how the British, that small, tiny little island, was able to control the entire world as the only one world government or something that would approximate that. And it was through economic warfare and illegalizing the right of colonies to have protectionism or to have national banks that could control their own emission of credit. So, I mean, it was literally Hamilton working with a small network of people like John Jay, Robert Morris, who were actually on the ground fighting like hell to try to find a solution to get the United States to become a manufacturing society, to eliminate, to get out of the crisis of unpayable debts, which they did. They paid off those debts by consolidating all of the state debts into a new federal debt that would then be tied to large-scale public works, building canals, schools, hospitals, roads, other forms of internal improvement that would stimulate the real economy, that would justify the growth of industries for the first time. So all of these things were just irrefutable data that I couldn't refute. Like, I couldn't say that didn't happen, and I couldn't say that Hamilton, I was still holding on to the fact that, okay, there was still, we read Hamilton's reports on manufacturers, or his report on the National Bank, or his report on the Mint, or his report on public credit, these big reports in 1790 and 91, which gave rise to a lot of the biggest changes in American defense and economic policy. You read the writings, and it becomes quite clear just by reading Hamilton how he was thinking and what the effects of his actions, what they were. So what I noticed, I guess, in hindsight, was a laziness in those narratives out there that were all painting him like a Rothschild stooge. creating a proto-Federal Reserve, is that nobody was actually reading Hamilton. They weren't acknowledging the facts that I was now confronted with. And if they did, they were just ignoring them and just continuing to hold on to their narrative. And then I also looked at the next broad thing, which comes in the volume 1 and volume 2 of my Clash of the Two Americas, was a bit more of a deep dive from a Canadian perspective too. So maybe that even kind of gave me somewhat of an edge, maybe because I'm not in America. I'm sort of looking at it as a Canadian, from the outside, kind of like trying to figure out why didn't we become the 14th colony to declare independence when Benjamin Franklin was up here in Montreal, trying to organize patriots to go down to the Continental Congress and sign on as the 14th colony. He tried. Ben Franklin tried for 6 weeks, and he couldn't do it. He got some patriots who did make the move, but most of them didn't. They were too controlled by British intelligence. So I'm looking at it from that standpoint. And one of the things I tried to figure out also is why did I looked at an assessment of every American president who died while in office. And another thing would strike anybody who looks at this question. And that means not just Hamilton, who wasn't president, but he had presidential material. But look at William Harrison, 1840, who dies after 3 months. Look at Zachary Taylor, 1851, who dies. Look at then obviously Lincoln and the greenback system Lincoln was bringing in with a protective tariff. Look at Garfield. And what was Garfield's economic policy, or especially his military policy to plan for an attack against the British Navy in 1880 before he was killed? What about McKinley and McKinley's protective tariff policy and internal improvements policy? What about Warren Harding, the last sort of Lincoln Republican of the 20th century, who died out of eating oysters in 1923? What about him? What was he doing economically to fight the League of Nations and the entire British control of a world government agenda back then? What about Franklin Roosevelt, who was reviving the Lincoln Greenback Hamiltonian policy under a new veneer in the 1930s and 40s? What about John F. Kennedy, who had a certain investment tax credit policy, protective tariff policy, also very much tied to constitutional banking, of a Hamiltonian character? And what I found is that to varying degrees, all the common thread behind every American president who dies while in office prematurely, including a couple of Secretary of States, is that they're all invoking the exact same system, which Jackson, who, by the way, when I mentioned that Aaron Burr had to escape America to go to Bentham's house in Britain for 5 years, the headquarters that he was using to plan the Western secession movement, or the creation of basically the new Louisiana Purchase territories that was going to be part of the Western Confederacy that would then take control of the North. It was Andrew Jackson's house. Andrew Jackson was his puppet, and it was through Jackson's manner that they were coordinating this entire plan that involved this whole whistleblower going public and saying this is happening, which disrupted the thing. And so when Jackson comes back a few weeks before the War of 1812, he reconstitutes his entire political machine, around which the two main figures are Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, who are then deployed increasingly to play a new role in the reconstruction of the Burr machine under a new veneer, which manifests in the overthrow of what John Quincy Adams was trying to do in the 1820s in the installation of Jackson, who himself was a genocidalist who killed thousands of Cherokee, empowered the slave power, the pro-British Confederacy slave power, who received all of the land that had been emptied out from Cherokee, overseen by Jackson, that was then given over so that they could massively increase the production of cotton. Black slaves who increased their population from 2 million to 4 million by 1860. So between 1836 and 1860, even though new inputs of black slaves from Africa had been banned, they were breeding black people like cattle, and they were not stopping. It was just accelerating in terms of the output, and most of that was being purchased by the British, by British industry, which is why the British wanted the Confederacy to win. They actually were putting a lot of effort through also their Wall Street traders, the Wall Street Democrat traders in the North, as well as the pro-British operatives in the South, and Canadian operatives also, which, the Confederacy had their biggest intelligence basing operations in British Canada, out of which was, the operation to kill Lincoln was run through Montreal, where John Wilkes Booth was receiving his orders. He was here for 5 weeks as well before he was sent down to carry out the hit. So you got this whole thing. And so it helped me to sort of see this as a tapestry, as sort of like a one organic idea. And then from there, I was able to start reevaluating some of my assumptions that I had gotten from things like Money Masters or the Austrian School, analysts from the John Birch Society and others who really took over the narrative of what conspiracies had to be observed through, or how to analyze conspiracies, which was through the Cold War lens. That it's this communist infiltration, that they want to destroy our freedoms, and it's this very low level, simplistic Cold War narrative that really shapes like the works of people like Anthony Sutton, who was otherwise not a bad researcher. He did a lot of good data collection, but he's still a hardcore libertarian ideologue who looks at the world and history through that lens of libertarianism, which itself is derived from the Austrian school, which was the Habsburg school, right, of Otto von Habsburg, the Habsburg Empire, the Inquisition, the Jesuit controllers, like that evil empire that didn't really disappear after World War I, though we're told it did. It didn't. It worked very closely with the same British operatives in the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha network of Britain that became Windsor. It's all one sort of inbred system of oligarchical mess, and their Austrian school, von Hayek's, von Mises, Karl von Menger's theories were just repackaged Adam Smith, which is just repackaged British Empire to justify why nations shouldn't really develop protectionism or national banking, or else they're anti-freedom. And so they look at things through that lens. And so every time that there's nation states that use national power to do things, it's all bad. They don't differentiate between a Hamilton, a Lincoln, or a Hitler, because you're using the nation to do things. Yeah,
nationalism bad. Yeah, man, that's wild. I had always been very confused of this Andrew Jackson good kind of trope, and because I was like, I've read about this guy and he didn't seem like a good guy, but all these guys, these new guys that I'm following, all these conspiracy theorists and stuff, say Andrew Jackson good because national bank bad. So that was definitely something that was like refreshing to see in your work. And were you aware, actually, that New York State, at the outbreak of the Civil War, had legislation on the table to join the Confederacy if the Union were to split apart? Were you aware of that?
No, I did not know that. I did not know that there was actually a move that came. You're saying that this actually came close from New York to join the Confederacy in the lead up to the Civil War?
Yeah, because they were worried about the cotton trade drying up. They didn't want it was one of their biggest exports, and it's always been a little historical kind of node that I've pointed to when people say something like, "Oh, we can't let them win a war. We can't let this country win against this other country. We have to intervene because the world will end if we go through and don't give these guys our full support." Which I've always been anti-war. And I actually encountered this. I had never read about this before. I have 500 books on the Civil War, maybe 3 of which I've actually read. But I never came across this. I learned it in Ken Burns's documentary on the Civil War. But yeah, that's what so New York State had legislation on the table to stay with the Confederacy, and their justifications for it were like, well, what's going to happen to our entire economic system if the cotton trade dries up, because we're still trying to be, and I thought of that immediately when I was reading your book and encountering the Wall Street elite that were aligned with the British Empire, the holdovers from the Revolution that were still, if not explicitly with the British Empire, they were at least ideologically with the empirical, the slave system, and like I was saying, like that is, it's rare that I encounter somebody's work that surprises me and makes me think differently. Obviously there's a sort of echo chamber kind of there's an echo chamber element of the communities that we all roll in. So it was very refreshing to hear that in your work. And I was very interested to hear about this whole other saga of Burr, because I have never encountered any of that either. And I always just kind of thought that he fell out of favor after assassinating, Alexander Hamilton, and just walked away into the sunset, and I had never heard anything about him afterwards.
Well, here's the interesting thing that I tried to get across in summary fashion, but much more has been written by better researchers than I on this particular topic. But that attempt to create the Western Confederation, that Western Empire that would then take over the North that I mentioned, was actually the third attempt by Burr to do this very thing of breaking up the Union into a North-South so-called free pro-British confederation that would then would dissolve the Constitution and reconstruct a sort of new nation around a pro-British, pro-free trade orientation, while letting the southern slave states become their own confederation with their own special peculiar relationship to Britain. And Britain was the ultimate manipulators behind the scenes, right? Like, just like today, the City of London was back then as well the international nerve center of global finance, global financial manipulation. And just like, today we've got a more complex form of international corporate interests that interface with the banking sector. Back then, it was still the private corporation. The world corporation was the British East India Company, which had control of international maritime trade routes. And that was just the way, by controlling 7 or 8 major nodes on the international sort of trade system overseas, and keeping everybody underdeveloped and dependent upon a supranational body of finance and corporate power, they were able to then manage the system from above like gods of Olympus. So Burr, they were manipulating both sides. Burr had tried in 1800. That was his whole gambit for the presidency against Jefferson was premised around the idea. And there's documentation that has proven this in hindsight. Unfortunately, at the time, they didn't have all of the material directly available, but this has been proven that he actually was working, had he been successful as president, would have been to break the North free and become like a free northern state that would integrate with British territories, British holdings in Quebec, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, and basically, have the South as their own slave society. The British were laughing, but it didn't work. Hamilton directly intervened, and Burr never forgave him. And then Burr he ran as a second attempt in 1804, after a few years as a lame duck president. He ran again, now this time to become the governor of New York in 1804. And he had, the entire Federalist Party of Hamilton pretty much was for Burr. Hamilton was essentially like a party of one guy. His, like, Pickering, the Eastern establishment, what are called the Boston Brahmins. You're down in Massachusetts, but you had the Boston Brahmins then and today, the Cabots, the Lodges, all of these nasty characters that gave rise to Skull and Bones, Princeton, the entire Anglo-American special relationship, all of that whole crowd, they were working with Burr to basically do it again, to try it after it failed the first time, to now have him set up in the engine, the economic engine of the Americas in New York as governor. But Hamilton again intervened, did everything he could in the position that he was as a private citizen at that time to disrupt Burr's gambit for becoming governor. Burr failed by a very slim margin, but he failed. And again, his plans fell through. And so it was only after killing Hamilton that he figured he could do it again. But this time, it didn't work again, because luckily you had like a Smedley Butler type character positioned at the right time in the right place at Andrew Jackson's house, taking names and giving it to Congress in 1807. So it had been tried 3 times. And the British always played that Achilles heel in America, which was obviously what's America's Achilles heel that's been played again and again and is still being played is obviously the race card. And the fact that there's a discrepancy between practice and theory, and how the Declaration of Independence is a beautiful document enshrining universal truths, but unfortunately, when you have a 3/4 clause for black slave citizens who are given like 3/4 or 3/5 of a human consideration, and you're allowing still slavery to exist, it makes you weak. It makes you a little bit hypocritical, and that was always what was being capitalized upon by America's enemies to try to break America from within. And as we see it now with BLM and the whole thing regarding systemic racism, they're still playing that up as a way to try again for a new play at a civil war in America, which, I mean, it's quite polarized. But yeah, I mean, Burr was terrible.
Yeah, and, I always, whenever I get to talking about Hamilton and Burr or anything like that, I have to hold myself back and not sing any of the musical, of which I am sure you have seen, maybe not as many times as I, however, I'm sure you have seen. So there, and this is what...
You've seen that more than once? You've seen Hamilton more than one time?
I can start singing it from the beginning now and finish in 3 hours at the end, if you would like me to. However, I think there's a couple of those voices I might not be able to do very well. But what's interesting is that because your book filled in a lot of empty gaps for me in these little just chunks of history that somehow or another got past me, but it really this push by the British to get themselves back into, to get America back into the fold of the empirical system that they were trying to set up. And by the time that, Cecil Rhodes sets up the Round Table Group and all this, they decided to go with the Commonwealth idea and allow the home rule, which is cheaper. It's cheaper than colonies, and you have the same amount of control, if not more control, because you don't have the pushback on the ground from people that don't like being empire subjects. And so the string was, with your book, for me, completed between that post-Civil War and that 1890s kind of gap that I had, which was really nice. And what did you think of? It's obvious that the Commonwealth system is the proto-UN, right? The proto League of Nations, before that whole idea actually became powerful enough in enough countries in order to start something like a world government, which even it's crazy that people still fall for that shit, but that point is moot. Where are you on the Round Table Group, the British elite there, the Commonwealth idea? What is your take on this? Because I obviously only had a week and I only got through volume 1. Where does your work take you through that string up to the League of Nations?
That's actually the thing that really revved my engine early on, because before I wrote the Clash of the Two Americas books, I had written 3 volumes called The Untold History of Canada, which all were based upon the considerations of Carroll Quigley's insights into the Round Table Milner Rhodes groups and their role in shaping almost everything of importance of the 20th century. Quigley dies in 1980, but his Anglo-American Establishment book, for me, and I'm guessing for you too, was really powerful, posthumously published. And he pieced, that provided a bit of a master key when combined with some of the material that I had researched over a few years with Executive Intelligence Review and the LaRouche organization. It gave me, a knife by which to cut through a lot of Gordian knots, especially regarding Canada. Because my original question is, what the hell is this thing called Canada? Before I wrote anything about America, it was really, what the hell is Canada? As far as a British-controlled operation that had never been given the ability, or every time we came close to becoming a sovereign country or a real republic at different times throughout history, there was sabotage to disrupt that and to keep us under the control of the British Foreign Office, the Privy Council of London, and the mothership, or the mother nation, whatever you want to call it. So the work by Quigley and LaRouche were both very important, and the Round Table movement was key. And I realized that the reason why all of the official narratives and historians all got it wrong is that they all treated Canada from the standpoint that they all assumed that Canada was a country, And I was like, wait a minute, no, we're not really a country. This is a synthetic. It's a synthetic psyop called a country, but it's not a country. It's got a, it's a monarchical system with a governor general as our head of state and lieutenant governors who are all members of the Order of Malta or the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, all of them, always, that are enshrined in our founding documents in 1860. An unelected privy council of private and public operatives who are maintaining a continuity of a civil service, sort of a deep state enshrined within our constitution. It's always been like that. And the democratic component of Canada is a very thin, low quality veneer. At different times, it did actually have some influence when there were American patriots. Usually, this is the irony, is that Canada developed or acted more like an authentic sovereign nation state only in those moments where you had an Abraham Lincoln or a McKinley or a John F. Kennedy or a Roosevelt doing battle against the globalist depopulation death cultists trying to manage things like the League of Nations. In all of its incarnations before and after World War I. So the Rhodes Roundtable movement was, I mean, for those people who may not have researched this, who are listening, this is part of a desperate reorganization of the British Empire, kind of like you'd think about a corporate management being, when a corporation is misrun, as the British Empire was increasingly misrun and was bankrupt and collapsing in the later part of the 19th century. There was a bit of a necessary bit of self-examination about what the hell will the British Empire be going into the 20th century. And there was a recognition, on the one hand, that certain ways of doing things weren't working anymore. Nation states were getting too many empowered ideas that they have the right to use protectionism modeled on what Lincoln was doing. And we saw it with Germany unifying around a Hamiltonian policy of the Zollverein, aka the customs union, which unified Germany from a bunch of, broken up, balkanized states into a unified country that would outproduce Britain in steel and iron and everything else within a very short time of doing this, while also working to avoid wars, create ententes and diplomatic positive relations with nations that the British Empire was trying to manipulate wars, because it's all about divide and conquer. That's how the empire works, is constant forever wars. Get your neighbors to fight, and then they're too busy killing each other to realize how both sides are being manipulated to destroy each other, while the lords oversee the chaos. So Otto von Bismarck, Sadi Carnot, the French nationalists in the 1880s and 90s who got to power, were working with Bismarck, applying Lincoln's economic program in France to break France into the modern age using, again, protectionism, directed credit. Russia, Alexander II and III were both, two assassinated Russian leaders who were also pro-American, pro-Lincoln, they were working with Lincoln Republicans who were in Russia helping to build the Trans-Siberian Railway, modeled on the transcontinental of what Lincoln was doing. And it was all based on interconnectivity, creating abundance, destroying the arguments of the Malthusians, who were always trying to get people, just like today, into the framework of thinking that we had to live with less. We have to justify famines, reduced population levels. That was what the British Empire was wired around for the 19th century, was the Malthusian population trap. That's why they murdered millions of Irish and even many more millions of Indians by design. It was for mathematical ratios to be met and the creation of scarcity. So this new system of what was known as then the American system, widely, and this is not me saying it, this is actually what people like Henry Clay, Lincoln's advisors, figures in Russia and even in Canada who were patriotic, were all describing this as, in opposition to the British system of free trade, looting, and speculation, was the American system of industrial capitalism that was premised around the idea of increasing the freedom of the individual while at the same time increasing the productive powers of labor of the societies by going into full spectrum economies and not being dependent on somebody else to meet the needs that you could meet yourself, such that any international trade, because trade was still good. It's not like, it's not like isolationism, which is how it's slandered by globalists. It's not that at all. It's just that it's fair trade. What you're trading with your neighbors is based on a fair trade of and a fair pricing of the commodity and the value of the labor of your neighbors, who are also able to, live a good life. And when you live a good life with a high quality of life, with a long longevity and a low infant mortality and a high quality infrastructure, it means that your labor is going to be more expensive, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And like McKinley said, those who want free trade and want to buy low, sell dear, they want cheap things, and cheap things make cheap men. And that's not the kind of country that he wants to lead, which is all about why we have protectionism, right? You want people who are labor to be well paid. So that was spreading. Britain couldn't really, everyone kind of got a sense from the way that Britain had been caught red-handed, sparking the Civil War. You know, the first international legal, what do you call it? The first international trial had happened at that time, overseen by Ulysses S. Grant before he became president of America, you know, and it was called the Alabama Claims, over the fact that Britain had been supplying logistically, militarily, financially, the Confederacy in breaking up the Union and providing all sorts of warships built by British manufacturing that were given to the Confederates to carry out the war. So that would, you know, Britain found themselves, they basically were caught red-handed. They had to pay $15 million to try to settle those claims. And it was discovered that, you know, they put a lot of effort into putting down rebellions in 1860 in India. You had the Crimean Wars, where Britain and France worked together to entrap Russia in a never-ending war that was designed to hollow out and destroy Russia in the 1850s. Everyone kind of smelled the dirty hand of the British everywhere, and nobody trusted their system anymore, and we're working for this other much, much more superior system of natural law. So Britain basically had to reorganize, and they did that under specifically two think tanks that worked very closely together, one with the center of operation in the London School of Economics and the other one in Oxford, and both were coordinated by Cambridge. So Cambridge, which is where you had sort of the Cambridge apostles, you know, the Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, John Maynard Keynes, they're all Cambridge apostles. Works very closely with the British Royal Institutes, Royal Societies. That's sort of the brains of empire, the arms, the muscle of empire, where you produce the ideological doers or upper level managers who will be your mercenaries in the system, will be processed through a special set of experiences in the London School of Economics and Oxford. One is where the Fabian Society was based, the other, which was formed in around 1884 by a bunch of eugenics-loving misanthropes around Beatrice and Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw, and later on H.G. Wells, a student of Thomas Huxley, becomes a leading light of that grouping. Alfred Mackinder, Lord Balfour, they're all members of this thing, leading figures. But they all work very closely with what is known as the Round Table movement that emerges out of the Rhodes Trust, which itself is part of this, the Lord Gascoigne Cecil, the former prime minister's network, who was also working very closely with Nathaniel Rothschild at taking the money that was extracted from Africa by Cecil Rhodes in a trust, and utilizing as a mandate or a constitution Cecil Rhodes's wills, where he lays out the need to recapture America, reestablish a new global empire, but also create a new disciplined civil service modeled on the Jesuits that would then be more trustworthy, because the former 19th century British Empire had a problem where they couldn't fully trust their auxiliaries. That was a big weakness. And it's something people underestimate, because, I mean, they still were utilizing, you know, a certain Anglican intelligence operation. And the thing about the Anglican Church is, yeah, it's a synthetic church with the crown at the head, sure. But at the same time, they do read the Bible. And so what would often happen is that their operatives, who were supposed to carry out a genocidal policy of evil, utilizing Malthusian logic on the natives, would often read the Bible and not sleep well at night. And they wouldn't always follow their orders. They would sometimes, you'd have even members of the House of Lords calling for dissolving the British Empire. You know, that was problematic. They're like, we can't trust. We need arms. We need people to make our thoughts materialized, and we can't trust our own people. So they had to tighten the ship a bit, you know. And so the processing system under what became the Rhodes Scholarship operation where selected talent, where there was a talent searching process in different parts of the empire. Young people who exhibited certain character traits were given opportunities, whether from rich or from poor families, to be processed in Oxford. Similar things were occurring in the Fabian Society School of the London School of Economics. And for those who really exhibited a certain sociopathic trait of fanaticism, they were propelled upwards. Some of them became Chris Christophersons and just found careers in country music, and they weren't very useful as Rhodes Scholars. But then some of them became Chrystia Freelands or Dean Rusks, the guy who managed the Korean War and Vietnam War, and they would then go on to infiltrate or permeate everything that had influence in everything, private sector, corporations, media, academia, government, the think tanks that were coordinating this growth. And this is where the League of Nations even emerges out of, where first they call themselves the Roundtable Movements, and then they sort of rebranded themselves in 1919. And became, or at least established, what were known as the Royal Institutes for International Affairs, with the controlling branch in London, sometimes called Chatham House. And then you had branches set up in America, for example, also established at the Majestic Hotel in France in 1919, the same place and the same time that they were formulating the configuration of the Versailles debt treaty repayments that were designed to destroy the German economy and set the groundwork for shock therapy and the imposition of Hitler fascism. That same place where they were also constructing the framework for the League of Nations as basically a one world government anti-nation state agenda. That was the same place that they formulated the Council on Foreign Relations. And it took them 2 years to finally create the groundwork in America, where the CFR was finally unveiled, run by a bunch of Rhodes Scholars and Fabians. People like Walter Lippmann, who's part of the Pilgrim Society networks in America, working very closely with Paul Vorberg, Edward Mandelhaus, the advisor of Woodrow Wilson, the racist puppet who oversees the installation of the Federal Reserve. All of these same creatures are all there at the heart of the growth of the Roundtable movement in America, this thing that Hillary Clinton later on calls the mothership, the CFR. That's what it is. And it's British. It's not American. And in Canada, we had our own branch set up under the Canadian Institute for International Affairs in 1928. We had a Fabian Society of Canada setting itself up officially in 1931, called the League for Social Reconstruction, founded by 5 Rhodes Scholars. A lot of eugenics love in there, all trying to propose the idea of a new scientifically managed society in the 1930s. Devoted to effectively population reduction, but under obviously a moral veneer of looking out for each other somehow. And so the fact that you had 5 Rhodes Scholars setting up the Fabian Society of Canada, one of whom goes on to become, one becomes the handler of a Fabian processed in the London School of Economics, called Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who comes back completely indoctrinated after having been groomed under William Yandell Elliott, who's a Rhodes Scholar in Harvard, controlling a sort of Harvard branch of Milnerites. Kissinger being yet another one, Zbigniew Brzezinski being another one of the Yandell Elliott boys, Pierre Elliott Trudeau being another Yandell Elliott boy. They're groomed there. God knows what the hell they're doing in the professor's back office, but whatever it is, Trudeau is deployed up to be groomed again now under Harold Laski, who was at this time in 1949 the primary leader of the British Fabian Society, who then sets Pierre Elliott Trudeau on an international sort of exploratory tour of the empire for 500 days, and then reestablishes him back in the Privy Council of Ottawa, where he's handled by one of the Canadian Fabian Rhodes Scholars, F.R. Scott. And F.R. Scott and Pierre and another are working very closely with a guy who goes on to create the basis, not only of the Canadian Roundtable, named S. Scott Reed, but S. Scott Reed, who's also a Rhodes Scholar, co-founder of the Canadian Fabian Society. He's the head of the Canadian League of Nations Society, and he goes on to become the architect of what becomes NATO after World War II. So he's actually the first guy who's organizing the framework of the collective security pact of NATO to get around the UN Security Council that had given too much power to nation states to veto things, veto policies of regime change. Like Russia and China were able to stop whatever type of military policy the Roundtable movement wanted to put into motion. So they had to get around that problem, hence NATO. And NATO sort of repackaged the worst elements of the collective security agreements of the League of Nations. That was what S. Scott Reed put into motion. And he was working very closely with leading Habsburg figures. As I mentioned, the Austrian school, libertarian ideologues that created things like the Mont Pelerin Society. They had their branches in America with what is known as the American Liberty League, which was working so hard. This is the J.P. Morgan funded operation of free traders passing themselves off as patriots, trying to keep America out of the war. But why? This is why people don't like Franklin Roosevelt, because he got us into the war that we shouldn't have been in. We should have not been in World War II. And it's like, well, wait a minute. The American Liberty League, which is the primary bastion of the anti-World War II movement at the time, they were working and being funded by the same fascists who were funding the growth of Hitler and Mussolini fascism across the ocean. The idea was a one world government of fascist enforcement that was supposed to win, and they were going to have their management jurisdiction of North America with their British control, like their British sort of senior partners across the ocean. And this would be what, would dominate regional control regions of the world under a global banker's dictatorship. And Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and Japanese fascists were all going to have various jurisdictions, and these Wall Street fascists were going to have their own. And so this is things like the Mont Pelerin Society, something that Friedrich von Hayek was a leading member of. And what Tony Blair and leading Fabians that controlled Britain, they were all members of the Mont Pelerin Society. They had branches of like the John Burke Society being one aspect of it in America, who wanted to reconquer and flush out those American patriots who understood the Wall Street London support of fascism. And they were all purged after Roosevelt dies in office. And all of these Anglophiles take control fully and take control of the United Nations, which was supposed to be a very different thing than what it became. The World Bank and the IMF were supposed to be something very different from what they became once they were infiltrated. Before they were even able to get off the ground, they were immediately taken over and turned into the very opposite of what their mandate was, which was originally to do what Harry Dexter White, the guy who fought Keynes at Bretton Woods, which was to provide long-term credit emissions for the industrial development of Africa, the creation of full spectrum economies around the world by replicating the success of the New Deal infrastructure projects in America, and do that for Africa, do that for India, for China, for South America and beyond. And that was supposed to be the direction that the world was going to go if Roosevelt and his allies had not been murdered and flushed under this new FBI-run dictatorship of the Five Eyes that took control of America and basically ran us into the ground ever since.
So you have zero fucking chill, huh?
Chill? What?
You have no chill.
Chill?
No,
I'm not hip with the lingo. I'm not hip with the lingo.
No, man, you just that shit was impressive, man. I have to say, like, you are one of the how old are you?
40.
You're not 40. Get the fuck out of here.
I just shaved, man. My wife has taught me how to use. My wife put some cream on my face at night, and somehow it keeps these wrinkles from cropping up, and it works.
Whatever you're doing, keep doing it.
And I can't grow a beard. I can't grow a beard like you, man.
That's all right. With great beard comes great responsibility. You don't want this chest hair. Yeah, no, man, it's fun. I wanted to stop you several times, but the reason for not doing so was twofold. One, the shitty internet connection. There's no way I could have stopped you on that rant without having there been this terrible Zoom moment. And secondly, like I am going to have to go back and rewatch that last 20 minutes, and I'm going to have a lot to research on my own, because there's a ton of stuff in there that I have no idea about or had no idea. And your understanding of history is it's unique. You got a great gift for all this.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
Like there's the way that you look at history is the way that I wish everybody at least strove for. A good thing, like if I'm interacting with somebody that doesn't know much about, like, let's say World War one thing that I'll suggest that they do, and even this in and of itself would be a monumental undertaking, is to read Lawrence Lafour's The Long Fuse, which covers that section of history from the unification of Germany to World War I, to give like that background, like that this war didn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of people, if you're learning about World War I, most people start at 1914, which is just ridiculous to absolve everybody of the intellectual responsibility of the last 100 years before it, and then to read at least the sections pertaining to World War I in Tragedy and Hope, and then Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. That was David Lloyd George's granddaughter wrote it.
Right on, eh? Yeah, I bought that book when I was working at a bookstore. I think, that's the one that came out in like 2004 or something, right? It's kind of new-ish.
Newish, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, she's a CFR, demoness.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. There's always shit you have to like wonder. Well, what is she leaving out of this picture? But it's definitely good. It's a very easy read, and it does paint a picture, a very thumbnail sketch. That's a good first approximation. That's for sure.
What I really appreciated about the book was the firsthand accounts. First of all, I mean, she got all of her grandfather's papers to write it and all of his diary entries. You get a day by day. Nobody goes into that kind of detail when they're talking about the Treaty of Versailles and the 6 months that changed the world. But that's what I'm talking about. Like, just this you need to understand history not in a vacuum as most people do, that chunk by chunk history. I mean, the fact that I had no idea what happened to Aaron Burr after he killed Hamilton, and pretty sure I studied the American Revolution for half of my school career. And it was with a lot of very important chunks left out. But this so what your work does is this constant. It outlines this constant battle that's been between empire and the American idea, of how a government should be by the people, for the people, kind of thing. So okay. A little bit of a left turn. Have you read Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley, his first book?
No, it's on my list, but I haven't read it. I haven't even read all of Tragedy and Hope. That's a big book, but I haven't finished that one either.
It is a big book. It's a monumental undertaking, but I mean, it's great for what it is.
I've read chunks of it at different things that interested me. I mean, but what's the evolution? So what's this first book about?
Oh, well, okay. So it's very interesting in that it's a book on historical analysis. So the book is about how to analyze history, and he's a big Toynbee guy. So he took the way that Toynbee viewed the rise and falls of civilizations and modified it to his own purposes, because he first started off in college as studying science, and then when he moved to the social sciences and started studying history, he was appalled that social scientists did not use science in their analysis of history. And so he tried to create a way of understanding history and what he called historical analysis by using science, and understanding that any conclusion that you reach about what you're working with in terms of evidence, it's only a hypothesis, and that it's not the final story. And that is something that, like, the Carnegie Endowment really sought to do in terms of education of history in America. The Carnegie Endowment decided that the best way, one, to change a country in a particular direction, and these guys were very much in favor of the British Empire way of doing things, but they decided that they needed to create their own stable of historians, and they needed to, because I think they had I always forget their names, the husband and wife couple that had whatever their names was. They were the first historians, the major historians that the Carnegie Endowment tried to get into their stable of historians, but they were like, no, we're not going to teach history this way. And the way that they chose to teach history was in this fragmented kind of way, that it's all separate from each other, and that this overarching narrative of, things like free trade are a good thing. Free trade good, protectionism bad, isolationism bad. And so the understanding of history, of which it seems like you have a wonderful grasp on, is this one of a continuum as opposed to history in a vacuum.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that there's a guy named Niall, not Neil Ferguson, Niall Ferguson. So Neil Ferguson is the COVID guy. Niall Ferguson is the British infiltrator of Harvard, this historian who's written some interesting books. But I remember him writing a book, or not a book, actually, it was a long essay in 2009, saying that the proper scientific method should be one for a historian that uses pure empirical mechanics. And so he starts by saying, by making fun of the fools who try to look for the causality of World War I in the ouster of Otto von Bismarck in 1890. And he's like, that's absurd. That's 24 years of separation between von Bismarck's ouster and World War. He's like, obviously World War I was caused by a Serbian Black Hand operative killing the Archduke. Of course it's that. And that's always been the problem of like causation throughout thousands of years. Is like how do we situate our mind to look for causality? If we take a purely materialistic standpoint, we run into this problem of an absurdity of infinite causes mechanically. Like, so what caused me to drop my pen? Well, one could say, well, mechanically, if I'm like a Bertrand Russell or somebody following what Niall Ferguson was proposing, I might say, well, it is whatever caused my hand to do that. Well, that was caused by what? My muscles unflexing at a certain point. Well, what was causing that? Well, that was my nerves that cause a certain electric frequency that is measurable to calibrate, that was tied to what? Tied to my forearm, that was tied to what? That was tied. And so you could just do this forever. There's an infinite, like minutia that you could get pulled into as purgatory. And you would miss the fact that the reason why I actually did that was to simply make a point. I've got a metaphysical, immaterial idea that I'm trying to communicate to listeners watching this video about how causation works. That idea is what shaped my physical being into choosing that example to showcase my concept, But it's an immaterial thought. So because it's immaterial, materialists or people calling science, saying that I'm a scientist and thus I'm an empiricist, somebody who believes in material sense perception as the basis of all truth, which is not going to get you very far at the end of the day. They don't acknowledge the existence of immaterial intentions, ideas. It's like it doesn't exist for them, because it doesn't fit the parameters of what they're comfortable with. Things that can be weighed, smelled, measured, put into different configurations within space and time, and then have data extracted and put onto charts, onto models. That's what they like. That is useful to a degree if it is used as a tool shaped by something else, but that something else has to be always the inquiring human mind that is itself able to penetrate behind the surface of things when it sees with the eyes of reason, right? What I'm looking for when I'm always looking for the scientific causation behind something, I'm looking for, well, what is the principle that shaped why something unfolded the way it did instead of some other way? I could have imagined history being a lot worse in so many ways over time than it turned out. I could also imagine it being so much better than it turned out. So I can imagine both worlds at different times. I could see, well, what would the world have looked like if JFK had chosen to not go to Dallas, Texas in a completely shady situation with his top-down car, knowing that he had a hit out. He just had avoided walking into an assassination plot just a couple of weeks earlier. So he should have been smarter than that. He walked right into something stupid. Well, what if he had more trustworthy people to work with? What if he survived that? What if he lived through his 2 terms? What would the world have looked like right now if even Bobby Kennedy had also survived into becoming the president, maybe even twice? What would the world have looked like if their policies had not been sabotaged for Africa? His work with Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, other South American liberationists and freedom fighters against empire. He had good relations and plans with all of them. So the world would have been a very different place, so a much better place, but it didn't happen that way. So, well, similarly, what if Washington and Ben Franklin had failed, right? What if their attempt, what if Aaron Burr had been successful and the American experiment would have been like crushed before it even got out of the cradle? That could have happened. Well, the world would have probably been under some techno-feudal empire, and we wouldn't have had even probably like the light bulb, frankly, because even the idea of like using electricity as a way to make life better for people came out of a purely political environment in America that was like an incubator for creative discoveries that were not being permitted within the British Empire. You couldn't. They just didn't allow for that type of spirit of curiosity and the expression of that in the form of people like Ben Franklin, who created a system of economic policy that would incentivize the individual to be a genius and to make inventions that they could then get money off of if the invention solved a big problem that were then accepted by society, that would then allow us to leap beyond the limits to growth, which is what the Malthusian order always denied, because the Malthusians always said, no, we have to adapt to the pre-existing limits, whatever they may be, of the material or the intellectual universe. The limits are what are controlled by sentinels who are adherents ideologically to the imperial mode of organization, who have to control the schools, control what ideas are permitted, what type of resources are allowed that are generally going to be monopolized by the British East India Company or the British Royal Africa Company or whatever else. And then we can get people to fight over diminishing returns of those resources in a system of forever war. That's just the way the empires have always worked. It's a simple formula. Keep them dumb, keep them desperate, keep them hungry, keep them fighting. Don't allow them to cultivate big ideas that might give them the idea that they're not cows. So, if the American Revolution had not worked or had been sabotaged earlier on, then yeah, we probably wouldn't have electricity, frankly. We'd probably still be living kind of like feudal serfs, and we wouldn't have been granted this time that we have now to organize, to have these conversations over, using incredible technology, which was made possible by the space program put into motion by John F. Kennedy. Were it not for John F. Kennedy, would there have been a space program? Well, I see no evidence that there would have really have been. Eisenhower's space program was shit. There was no proper backing for anything ambitious. So it was only when JFK took it to the next level, jacked up the GDP, to 4% for financing of space tech, that we all of a sudden started making serious breakthroughs. New scientists were able to test out their prototypes. And we have now, things like satellite tech that could be used for bad, as we see some assholes in Davos wanting to use satellite tech as a better way to control us, or having this type of conversation. The internet came out of things like the space program, and so these are dual use techs, but they wouldn't have been there either way if you didn't have a JFK. So that's how I think the science of history, and I really was influenced by reading. As I mentioned, the old man LaRouche, he died a few years ago at 96, but this guy was a phenomenon. He ran for the presidency 8 times, got thrown into prison by Robert Mueller back before it was popular in the 80s. And including all of the key collaborators he was working with in the 80s when he was running for the presidency, when he was becoming an advisor to various governments in India and Mexico and Africa. He was actually he was shaping to a certain very important degree policy. And that became too troublesome for a lot of these establishment, sociopaths in America that utilize the FBI to try to snuff him out, do a lot of character assassination. What they did for 40 years of media coverage is either ignore him, or if you don't ignore him, slander him as an anti-Semitic fascist or something. And all that to say, you read his writings and you start seeing why he had all these enemies, why he found himself in a Virginia prison, because he's actually showcasing what a real science of history actually looks like. And he's pointing out different great minds in the past who also tapped into this science of history, not the way Quigley is necessarily talking about, it seems. Definitely, anyway. But it's really a science like I didn't come up with the things I just said necessarily. They're my words. I thought about them, but the technique of this analysis, it comes from Socrates, looking at the Phaedo dialogue of Socrates, who's the first one that example I had of the pen and the proof of like the higher causation of ideas. That's Socrates demonstrating that there is a soul that has a certain characteristic that is immortal, to his young disciples who are sad seeing that he's about to be killed by the demos of ancient Athens. It's the night where he's going to have to drink the poison hemlock. And all of his disciples are super sad, and he's not that sad, because he's like, well, look, you shouldn't. This is the liberation of my soul from my body, and a true philosopher who pursues truth should actually look forward to the day that he gets to be unshackled from the confusion and desires and passions of the flesh. And his followers don't believe him, so he has to go through a dialectic to showcase, because they're not confident that there is a soul that one should be happy about. Maybe you just disappear once you die. That's a scary thing. And so he takes them through this set of proofs using a really wonderful set of lines of inquiry, which are great. But you apply it, and every time you apply this method of looking for the invisible but real higher reality above the material domain of reality, that is the reality of that which always is, of being, where justice, freedom, all of these higher states of existence are found above the material world, because you'll never see justice. You'll see just actions. You'll never see freedom in its essence. You'll see people fighting against tyranny for freedom, animated by love of freedom, but you'll never see freedom unto itself, just like you'll never see, in a lower order, dogness or catness. You'll see an infinite variety of cats or dogs that are unlike, grasshoppers. They have certain unifying characteristics, but they're not the purity of what makes them cat or dog. There's something else. That's maybe a lower order. But all scientists who are making discoveries and eurekas that then manifest in new insights into the universe, or new technologies, if you're doing it from the standpoint of like, what's this stuff coming out of the clouds that's scary and makes noise, electricity, how do we then understand it and then utilize it to then make new inventions? Well, all of a sudden, with that application of what was an idea in the material world, we now have the ability to support more people at a higher quality of life. And we overcome the limits to growth that were constraining us when we were ignorant of those ideas, those eurekas. And that's, again, the way to break free of the any system of empire, is to recognize that the empire is aware of everything I just said. That's the sort of secret science of the elite that they're privy to when they groom their young, is what is the science of human management. And they're just their problem is that they become aware of this reality, but then they are programmed by things I don't fully understand, but something is killed inside of them, is murdered inside of them, that then induce them to find ways of creatively coming up with systems that disrupt and destroy that natural flow of human beings relating to their soul, to God, the creator, the laws of creation, and making their lives and the world that they live in more in tune with that creation that produces qualitatively good effects. So we become severed from that, and we become more at odds with ourselves individually, within ourselves. We become more at odds with our neighbors, our family, more inclined to want to, to have to look for therapeutic modes of drug recreation, just to like numb the existential nihilism of living in a world that's dying and being told to be happy about it. Well, of course that's going to make you unhappy. Of course you're going to need antidepressants or drugs of some other sort. Of course you're going to want to like embrace video games or anything that numbs the pain, because it's like unnatural to do that. We're a creature of creative love and growth and reason. And when we're like being told to adapt to a dying system that's unnatural, of course we're going to feel the way that most people tend to feel, especially if they're young. But, you got to fight against that as far as, feeding the soul off of something a little bit higher. So.
Fantastic, Matt. I think I'm going to leave it there, because that's a wonderful message to end the podcast on. And dude, you are
Cool.
you are a goddamn superstar, and I want you to let the people know where they can find your work. Just so I know you have that 4-volume set, but you've also done more books other than that, and you have an audio book, at least of the first volume, available. Let everybody know where they can find all your work.
Yeah, thank you. Plug time. I love those things. Yes. Well, okay. I guess the best thing would be, like you just said, there's a lot of books. They can go to CanadianPatriot.org. Easy to find all of those books. Some of those that I mentioned that I co-wrote with my wife, Cynthia Chung, who's a brilliant writer herself. She's actually written a new book that goes to a degree into the depths that I have never been, into the 19th century origins of international fascism, where she pulls up some crazy stuff. It's called The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set. In fact, I'll send you a copy of her book. At some point, you might want to interview her. I think it'd be a fun conversation. So all of that's available there. Also, there's the risingtidefoundation.net, sort of a nonprofit, more educationally oriented platform I created with my wife a few years back. That's more for, helps out a lot of, the idea was to sort of like try to work with homeschoolers, give people a sense of like what a high quality curriculum would be if we were in a healthy society. And that's risingtidefoundation.net, or lastly, Substack. That's sort of our bread and butter these days. So MatthewEhret.substack.com is the way people can just stay up to date with my writings, interviews, free and paid stuff, all that.
Absolutely. I will have all that in the show notes. Matt, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Hey, dude, it's a pleasure. Thank you.